From the virtual newsroom of Impact Alpha, this is your Impact Briefing for Friday, July 10th. I'm Monique Aiken. Today, I talk with Impact Alpha's David Bank about the word of the week in impact investing, toppled. And we'll round up agents of impact who've been leaders for years and even decades in the movement for racial justice within finance and investing. Here's Illiman Capital's Darren Dodson.
This moment, it doesn't create an opportunity, it reveals an opportunity that was always there.
But before we do that, here's what you need to know from this week in impact investing. It was a bad week to be an oil pipeline. The embattled Dakota Access Pipeline was shut down by a federal judge. The long-delayed Keystone XL pipeline was held up even further. And two major utilities threw in the towel on the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. Even more so than the oil in the ground, pipelines and other fossil fuel infrastructure are quickly becoming stranded assets. Generation Investment Management, the $20 billion firm co-founded by Al Gore and David Blood, released its 2020 Sustainability Trends Report. They say the COVID disruption has broadened awareness of inequality, injustice, and an economy that is living beyond its resources. The Global Impact Investing Network reports that 1 in 5 impact investors are cutting back commitments in response to the COVID crisis. The pullback is hurting fundraising, even for managers that have built in first loss or other protections for investors. Impact investors are redesigning underwriting and due diligence practices for the new normal. Victor's Capital closed on nearly $22 million to back female founders. Lori Cashman and Suzanne Norris have made more than a dozen seed investments. It's going to take a lot more to close the gender gap for venture capital funding. Despite growing awareness, venture funding to female founders is stuck in the low single digits. Hedge funds are coming to impact investing. Marshall Wace is launching a $1 billion ESG hedge fund to buy stocks that have strong environmental, social, and governance characteristics and bet against those that don't. In a big solar merger, Sunrun, the number 1 residential rooftop company, will buy number 2 Vivint Solar. If approved, the merger would create a $9 billion solar powerhouse, even as only 3% of U.S. households have installed solar panels. I'm joined now by David Bank to discuss the word of the week.
Hey, Monique, it's been such a delight to have you on the Impact Alpha team.
Happy to be here. So let us know a little bit more about this word.
Well, each week we try to kind of capture the zeitgeist. With all the discussion of tearing down statues, we thought of some other icons that are tumbling down and even more that deserve to be toppled.
Well, I, for one, am celebrating those statues part, but let us know what else you think we're thinking about.
Well, you mentioned one, the pipelines. So the pipelines are, sort of, in a sense, statues to a fossil fuel past that is, that day is passing. Just as another sort of example, Spain, I think last week or end of last month, shut down half of its remaining coal-fired power plants. And in many parts of the world, new solar projects are coming in cheaper than operating even existing coal plants. Mm-hmm. So it's cheaper to build a new solar plant than it is to operate an old coal plant. So let's topple them as well.
Well, as a former commodities person, I'm all the way here for that, and I get it. Really delighted to see those curves coming down, cost curves coming down.
There's also some kind of, conceptual structures, as you were. This might be a stretch, but that deserve to be toppled. So, one that's gotten a fair amount of attention in the last couple of years is this notion of shareholder primacy, the notion that businesses exist only and solely to, deliver returns to the shareholders. It's being replaced kind of by a notion of stakeholder economy, that employees, customers, suppliers, communities, the earth itself are all kind of stakeholders. But there's lots of examples where that old shareholder primacy, like in a sense, like, sort of like just like the Confederate general statues, they're it's kind of everywhere, right? So,
and so what of fiduciary duty? I understand there was some talk around what's happening in that.
Well, that's another one. That's another one of these, things that gets trotted out in a sense to defend the old order that that somehow thinking about the environmental, social, and governance, so-called ESG factors of investments is somehow going to hurt, say, pensioners, and so managers shouldn't take those things into account. That's the position actually of the Department of Labor right now in some new guidance they're issuing. A bunch of impact investor and sustainable investing types are writing letters and taking on the proposed guidance. But that's another, that old notion of fiduciary duty is another sort of statue due to be toppled.
And Europe actually has been out front in that, thinking about it literally the opposite way. So now
Indeed.
how are we going to continue to topple and uproot these practices, perhaps unexamined or maybe uninformed by data within finance and investing, as well as including in impact investing? Let's take this opportunity, as folks talk about rebuilding better, to rethink everything.
Hear, hear.
So speaking of rethinking, this week, Impact Alpha is rounding up agents of impact who have been doing just that. They've been doing the work of toppling systems and assumptions, practices, and power structures within finance and investing. Here's a sampling. Brian Dixon and Kapoor Capital are delivering outperformance in venture capital by betting on the lived experience of underrepresented founders to close opportunity gaps for communities of color. So too is Impact America Fund's Keisha Cash, who is on the hunt for companies capturing billion-dollar markets by better serving America's overlooked communities. And Backstage Capital's Arlen Hamilton is redefining who writes the checks in venture capital and who receives them. Darren Dodson of Illiman Capital is optimizing investment decisions and boosting impact by helping fund managers mitigate their implicit biases with evidence-based practices. Here's Darren again.
Without doing it and examining these different issues, they're not only violating their fiduciary duty by achieving lower returns, but they're also complicit in a system that believes that impact investing is doing good across environment and financial inclusion and these other wonderful things that are done in the world. But what they don't realize is they're increasing the barriers to women and people of color when they don't think about these issues.
You can learn more about these and all of our agents of impact in the brief and on Instagram at Impact Alpha. That's it for your impact briefing this week. You can read more about all these stories at impactalpha.com. Thank you for listening, and thanks to David Bank and our producer Isaac Silk, who edited this episode. I'm Monique Aiken, VP of Programs at Mission Investors Exchange, and make sure to check back next week for the latest impact investing news.